favorite conferences because it's very unusual to get an opportunity to be at a place where we have both technology service providers and consumers or clients in one place and exchange ideas and so on and so forth. So I'm really excited to be here, really excited to get a chance to meet all of you over the course of the next day or two, and also honored to speak here today. So, you know, the folks at Avasant asked me if I would speak about reimagining the future of tech-enabled services, and that's sort of a very broad and daunting topic, so I thought a lot about it before saying yes that I would do this, because I wasn't sure that I would have anything particularly insightful to say. But, you know, I do believe that, all kidding aside, that we are sort of at a very important moment in the evolution of the technology services industry. And so both from the perspective of the providers and also from the perspective of the buyers, this is a time of great change and an exciting time, I think. And so what I propose to do over the next 30 minutes or so is give you a little bit about my perspective, a little of my perspective on that change that's occurring and what it means if you're a technology services provider on one side or if you're a buyer on the other side. And so I'm going to start, if you will, with perhaps stating the obvious, which you saw in the videos, which has been well teed up. But the obvious statement here is that over the last 4 years, more or less, maybe a little longer, we've seen these massive tailwinds behind digital transformation. Right? It's really unprecedented. What we've seen is a $1 trillion digital transformation services market emerge. We've seen technology stacks becoming more and more complicated, and that is sort of leading to an acceleration in the growth of tech services businesses. In all the years that I've been in the tech services industry, I don't think I've seen a time of greater technology innovation. There's so much tech innovation going on right now, and that makes it extremely exciting on one side, but kind of daunting on the other side, because there's all this tech that needs to get implemented. And so we have, you know, a huge market, this emergence of very complicated and fragmented technology stacks. And that's resulting in a tech services ecosystem that's more fragmented than I've ever seen it before. There are literally thousands of companies in the technology services space, each focused and specialized on a particular niche, a particular area, and doing really well. And so you have a sort of a complicated market structure that's emerging. And against that backdrop, I would say that legacy IT services providers have a challenge of retraining, reskilling, rescaling their people. And so there's a lot of market dynamics going on, but hopefully none of this is news. Hopefully all of this is relatively evident. You've seen all of this in your day-to-day work. What I want to do is sort of dig a little bit deeper. Like, what's going on underneath this? What's going on behind the scenes here that's causing all of this to happen? And what I'd like to do is take you through this from the lens of the things that have historically driven change in our industry, the technology services industry. And so if you go back and you look back at the technology services industry and you say, what are the things that have driven change in the industry over the years? The first is relatively obvious, right? Technology waves have always had an impact on the industry. Every time there's a new technology wave that emerges, there's a new breed of IT services providers that emerge. And you could go back to the mainframe era when we saw firms like EBS and CSC emerge. You can go to the client-server era where you saw firms like Cambridge Technology Partners, the internet era where you saw firms like Viant and Cyient and so on and so forth. So technology waves have always had a impact on the technology services or the IT services industry. That's the first change vector, the first change driver in the tech services industry. And we are in the middle of this digital wave. And even though I've drawn digital on this slide as a single S-curve, I think all of you are probably well aware that digital is actually many, many S-curves all on top of each other. There's the cloud S-curve, there's the mobile S-curve, there's now the AI S-curve, and so on and so forth. So this thing, I think for convenience, we've lumped it all together and called it digital, but it's many, many S-curves. So the first change vector in IT services is the technology change that's happening. The second thing that we see is that economic cycles create change in the technology services industry. And if you look back at history, you'll see that in 2001 we had the economic event as a result of the dot-com boom and then the dot-com bust. And then we had the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. And in those moments in time, you also had changes in the IT services, technology services landscape. So that's your second change vector. The first is technology waves, the second is economic cycles. And then in the time that I've been, almost 30 years to the day that I've been in technology services, there's one other change vector, and it's only happened once in those 30 years, that's caused a big change in IT services, and that's a fundamental business model disruption, which happened in the 1990s when offshoring happened. And we discovered that you could move work to other parts of the world, and that was a fundamental business model shift that took place. So these are the three vectors of change in technology services. And historically, these change vectors have impacted the industry at relatively discrete moments in time. You see a moment when technology is changing, you see other moments when you have an economic cycle. We had one moment when there was a big business model disruption. But I would submit to you that what's interesting about right now, the moment we're in right now, is that we're at a point, an era, when all these three things are happening in the industry simultaneously. We have incredible technology change that's going on. There's so-called digital technologies, including this explosion of innovation. And that's only been heightened by AI and generative AI and sort of everything else that we've started to see in that ecosystem more recently. So you have incredible tech change going on right now. We're clearly in the middle of some sort of an economic cycle, and it's a unique economic cycle. It's not perhaps one that we've seen, at least in the recent past. We're seeing signs, to some extent, of slowing demand, but at the same time, we still have high inflation, low unemployment, high wage inflation in many parts of the world. So it's an interesting time from an economic standpoint as well. And then finally, we have, I believe, a business model shift that's going on for the first time since offshoring. And I think that business model shift is sort of the convergence of AI and everything that AI is going to do in terms of driving productivity with the gig model and gig workers. And those two things together are going to drive a fundamental change in the IT services business model. So we're living at a moment where all three things are happening all together in the industry. And it's something I haven't lived through before. I haven't seen it before all together, right? So the intensity of change is likely to be, in my view, more than it's been, at least in the last 30 years. So what does that mean? What I thought I would do is take you through my perspective on what these three things mean for providers on the one side. So if you're in the audience and you are representing the providers, what does that mean for you? And then look at it from the client lens and say, if you're a client looking to buy IT services, what does it mean for you? So we'll start with the providers. So what does it mean for providers? What should providers do? But the first is the first vector is this technology change. And so I would say the headline here is that service providers risk irrelevance faster than ever before, because innovation is happening so fast that if you get on an S-curve, those S-curves, those cycles are becoming shorter and shorter and shorter, and they're overlapping each other. And so if you're not constantly reinventing yourself as a provider, you're going to be irrelevant really, really fast. And so being able to map the terrain hyper-aggressively to understand what's going on in the world of fundamental technology innovation, whether that innovation is coming from the venture capital community, whether that innovation is coming from the more mainstream independent software vendors, whether it's coming from the hyperscalers, or indeed whether it's coming from fundamental R&D that's coming out of the labs, the universities, and so on and so forth. You've got to understand what's on the horizon. I think all of us in this room, if I ask for a show of hands, I bet you that most of us were surprised by how quickly generative AI happened. One day we were thinking that AI is 5 years in the future, and the next day it was on top of us. And we were all talking about the impact of it. I think the world in general got caught off guard by how quickly that all happened. And I only bring that up because if you were one of the few amongst us that were ahead of that, then kudos to you. It probably means that you were mapping the terrain aggressively and sort of understanding what's happening out there. And so the question is for the providers is, what is the next generative AI? While we're still trying to figure out what generative AI means for our organizations, you've got to be mapping the horizons, mapping the next set of things that are going on out there and doing that hyper fast. And then you've got to, because there's so much fragmentation, you've got to pick your bets systematically. There's so much technology change right now that you can't be all things to all people, right? And so you've got to pick your bets, make bets strategically, put your chips down, if you will, on the table, and try to manage that portfolio as actively as possible, all with the goal of trying to fight irrelevance. While you're doing that, you've got this economic cycle going on. And if you're a provider and you've lived through past economic cycles, what happens in an economic cycle? The first reaction in an economic cycle of buyers is to put pressure on price. I mean, let's face it, that is what happens in an economic cycle. The problem is, I think this economic cycle is different. This is an economic cycle where, because inflation remains high and unemployment is low, putting pressure on price and trying to or manage through an economic cycle on the basis of price is going to be tough. And so I think that the good providers managing through this next cycle are going to focus on relevance and really try to be deeply relevant to the customer and use productivity as opposed to price to try to demonstrate that relevance to the customer. This is a really, I think, important point because I think that the economy is such, and I don't see the wage pressures that we're seeing in most parts of the world for technology workers abating anytime soon. I think that if you look at the data, even though you've seen some headlines around tech worker layoffs in the United States, a lot of that is very, very contained to a small number of companies. And it hasn't had much impact on overall tech unemployment. And so if you're a provider, what do you do? The first is you've got to automate everything. We've said this in the past, but there's a new frontier of automation, right? Let's face it. AI and some of these and technologies like AI are pushing the frontier of what's possible to automate. And so you've got to be able to automate and drive unit costs as low as possible. I think there's going to be a new way of developing software in particular that emerges. I'm calling it AI Agile, where you have AI-infused agile teams. And so sort of with a human in the loop, but with AI helping, using tools like Copilot and Code Whisperer and so on and so forth. And so getting on top of that and being able to demonstrate the productivity of that for your customer is going to be incredibly important. And being able to actively measure that. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, because the IT services industry has been notoriously bad at measuring productivity. We don't know how to measure productivity really well in technology services. So I think focusing on productivity, not price, is the response that I would say on the economic cycle. So while you're trying to figure out what's going to be the next S-curve, what's the next thing, you also have to be figuring out how to drive productivity, because you're in the middle of an economic cycle. And last but not least, you're in the middle of this business model change as well, which means that you have to be thinking about what is AI, what do gig workers in particular, what do those mean for your enterprise? And I think that here, what I would say is, you have to be jumping on the AI and the gig bandwagons really aggressively. You have to figure out in what you deliver to clients how to make everything smart. Every application going forward is going to be an AI application. Every business process is going to be AI enabled. And so in everything that you're delivering to your clients, you've got to be thinking about what is the AI dimension of that client deliverable. Because the tech stack has become so fragmented, and we don't have, like we did in past generations of technology, these large monolithic ecosystems, it's very, very difficult to build large benches within a technology services provider. So you've got to be able to use gig workers and flexible work staffing models to build a bench of millions, as I say, because you don't know where the next demand is going to come from. You don't know which is the next technology that your customer is going to adopt. And by the way, because you have the fragmentation of technology, the market opportunities around each individual technology are smaller than they were in the past. And so because of that, gig workers are going to become, in my view, a very important and essential part of technology services businesses. And then finally, you have to be using AI to automate as much as you can in your back office. Most IT services businesses that I've seen are not really sophisticated in how they run the back office. I mean, it's just a fact. And so AI, again, is going to be able to, particularly in the talent areas, in matching demand and supply, in managing careers, in workforce development and things like that, I think AI is going to play an important role. So this is a quick, this is my snapshot of, if you are a provider, what should you be doing? You should be really mapping the terrain aggressively to fight irrelevance, because technology is changing faster than we've ever seen before. You need to be thinking about productivity to offset the economic cycle, to be able to stay relevant to your customer, to be able to show to your customer that you can do more with less, that you're able to, and you can objectively measure that, which is something that's been hard to do. And then you need to be thinking about, what does the IT services firm of the future look like with all of these business model changes that I think AI and gig workers are going to certainly drive. So a lot to do, which is why I said this is an important time, and a time when I think the landscape of technology services will change quite dramatically, because you have three things going on simultaneously, and I would argue for the first time perhaps in history, at least in the 30 years that I've been in the industry. So that's a little bit about what providers, those of you that are providers here in the audience, in my view, should be thinking about. What does it mean on the other side for the buyers? If you're a buyer of technology services, what should you be looking for? And I'm going to take the same three change vectors and talk that through from the buyer standpoint. So technology, if you're a buyer, what should you be looking for in a provider? I think the first thing is this question of skill versus scale. There are scale providers out there. The big scale providers, many of them are in the room here. I ran one for many years. I know that space. And for a long time, the big scale providers were emerging as sort of one-stop shops. You could go to them and say, I'm going to get all my technology services needs from one of the large global systems integrators. I think what we're seeing now emerging because of the dynamics that I talked about is scale complemented by scale providers. The scale providers just can't be good at everything. It's just not possible given the fragmentation of technology. There's too much fragmentation right now for the big providers just to be good at everything. They play a very important role in the ecosystem and they'll continue to be very, very important and very relevant. But they will be complemented, and you should be thinking about how you complement your scale providers with highly focused, skilled providers that are very, very skilled in particular areas that are most relevant to your ecosystem. So we're already seeing the emergence of, for example, I've listed a few examples on the slide, digital engineering providers, firms like EPAM and Globant. The firms in green are the firms that my firm recognized and invested in. So we are investing against creating this next generation of technology services winners. That's what Recognize does. And so Signal that I've listed there is our investment in digital product engineering. So and then if you look at analytics, you see firms like Tiger and Fractal emerging, and our investment in a business called Blend 360, again, high-end data science, very, very focused around just that part of the ecosystem. And then similarly, you've got data and AI, and firms there emerging like Quantify and our business, SpringML and TradeViews and so on and so forth. Those are just 3 examples. If I had continued to list, I would have gone on and on and on. There's specialized cloud providers, there's 5G players, there are IoT players, and on and on and on. Each technology category has multiple specialized providers. So the first point I would make is that you think, as your buyer, you think about technology change vector. I would say you should be thinking about skill and scale together. What is that portfolio of providers that you're going to use to give you the scale on one side, but the skill on the other side? You're also dealing with an economic cycle. And during an economic cycle, as a buyer, as I said before, the historical reaction is to pull back, is to say, well, you know, the future is less certain, my earnings are more volatile, and so perhaps the right reaction is to squeeze my providers on price. I don't think that's going to work this time. And I think perhaps more than any other time, squeezing providers on price in this environment is going to result perhaps in reduced quality. And the reason for that is this is a very different economic cycle. It's an economic cycle where we still have high inflation, particularly wage inflation for technology workers. And so if you squeeze on price, it's going to lead to, all else being equal, I believe it will lead to a compromise in quality. And so I think that the core focus in reacting or responding to the economic cycle should be to really try to understand how you can truly measure the productivity of your providers. You understand what's going on out there with the workforce that you have, your workforce and the workforce from providers, and really understanding the productivity of that workforce and measuring the providers based on productivity, not based on price. And so focusing smartly on productivity, I think, would be the first point I would make. Look for creative ways to measure productivity and then work with your provider on that. We've associated with it, or related to that, is, as I said, finding providers who truly are embracing the gig model. so that can variabilize your cost, so that you can measure productivity and you can variabilize your cost. So our investments in businesses like Torque, which is a gig worker platform, and Codalike, which is a tool that allows you to measure developer productivity at a very granular level, are two key bets that we've made based on that trend. We're also seeing a trend towards what I'm calling new shoring. What is new shoring? We're seeing that clients are looking at two things. One is, what are new functions that haven't been offshore before that I can perhaps move to other parts of the world to drive productivity and drive cost. And so we've seen this happen in marketing. Marketing has largely not been outsourced, but as marketing becomes more technology enabled and more technology driven, we're seeing more and more marketing, as one example, moving to other parts of the world. And similarly, we're seeing the emergence of new geographies around the world that historically didn't participate in the global sourcing, the global shoring model, emerging as new opportunities. And in many cases, some of these geographies have talent pools that are not, where the labor is not quite as tight, where the labor markets are not quite as tight rather, and therefore you have a little bit more freedom and flexibility. And then finally, I would say you've got to look for providers who can really engage with you in that kind of a dialogue, who have the consulting experience and who have the front end, who can really have a debate with you and a discussion with you around complicated issues around productivity, and not just have a price conversation with you. So on the technology side, it's this skill versus scale. You're going to be dealing, I think, with an ecosystem of providers that's broader, a greater number than perhaps you had to deal with in the past. And then from an economic cycle standpoint, you should be focusing on measuring productivity and being smart, as opposed to using a kind of a brute force or a blunt price instrument to try to manage through the economic cycle. And finally, the business model change. What as a buyer, what should you do about the business model change? And I would say that, as I said a minute ago, I think every application going forward will be rewritten as an AI application. And so I heard a stat the other day that 500 new million apps will need to be built. I'm not sure what the basis of that was, but even if it's half right, there's a lot of work that you need to get done. And I think related to that, the entire software development lifecycle, from requirements all the way through deployment, will become AI infused. That doesn't mean, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate about whether AI will make software development, will make programming obsolete. And I don't think that's the case, but I do think that we will see significant productivity improvements as a result of infusing AI through the software development lifecycle. And so you should be looking for providers that are on the leading edge of that understand how to rewrite your apps as AI apps, that understand how to infuse productivity throughout the software development lifecycle, that understand how to measure that productivity so that you can objectively see that they're able to deliver more code with fewer resources. And finally, you should be looking for providers, as I said, that really get the gig model, who really understand that a large part of success going forward is going to be able to tap this global virtual workforce, the workforce that hasn't been generally tapped before, to address the changing dynamics in the industry. And so I think about this as, if you're a buyer, you should be looking for service providers who are really rethinking every layer of their business model. They're rethinking their talent strategy, they're thinking about their service delivery strategy, and they're rethinking their client engagement or their delivery to clients and what they deliver to clients, their service strategy. All three of those need to change and evolve in this new world. I'm going to leave you with one or two final thoughts. As I've shared these thoughts with you, I've shared them with others, one of the reactions I get from people is, I think you're overreacting, Frank. Like it's not that profound, it's not that different. We're going to go back to the way things were. This is a moment, it'll pass, and then things will go back to the way that they used to be. I remember, people have said to me, I remember the good old days. We're going to go back to the good old days in the industry. I'm not sure that's going to happen. And I was thinking about how to best make that point, and I came across this survey. If you haven't read it, I don't know if there are colleagues here from Deloitte, but Deloitte just did this great work where they surveyed a number of folks from across generations. And so they said, look, they asked the same questions of Gen Xers and Boomers, so people who are 41 years and older, and then they asked those same questions to Gen Z and Millennials, so people who are 14 to 41 years old. And the first question they asked is, are online experiences more meaningful, or are they meaningful replacements for in-person experiences? Only 19% of the Gen Xers said so, but half of the people 14 to 41 years old said that online experiences are meaningful replacements for in-person experiences. So half of the younger generation, people 14 to 41 years old, are saying that they would prefer or that they find online experiences to be a meaningful replacement for in-person. Similarly, they asked, do you spend more time interacting with others on social media or in the physical world? And again, you see a similar pattern. The younger generation, 48% say they spend more time interacting with other people on social media than in the physical world, compared to 20%. And finally, and this one I think was the one that really blew me away. They asked, do you socialize more in video games than in the physical world? Socialize more in video games than in the physical world. And 40% of the young generation said that they socialize more in video games than in the physical world. I mean, these are profound. I mean, if you think that digital transformation is going to plateau and like other waves of technology, I just don't see it happening. I think that we are at this moment in time where we have an unbelievable evolution in technology, a revolution in technology, let me say. We have innovation happening faster than it's ever happened before. We have what I hope is a momentary economic event, which will work its way through the cycle. But nevertheless, as we think about the short term, we have to consider it. And I think all of this is going to need to drive a very, very fundamental change in the business models of the technology services industry. All of that to say, as I wrap up, that this is an incredibly exciting time to be in this industry. It's an incredibly exciting time to be a technology services provider. And it's an incredibly exciting time to be a buyer of technology services, because I've never seen this much change in the industry. I've never seen this much innovation in the industry. I've never seen this much opportunity in the industry. And so I hope that over the next day or two, we'll have a chance to debate those issues. Hopefully this set the stage a little bit for a framework that we can use to discuss and debate the issues. I'd love to talk to you more about what we're doing at Recognize. We view ourselves as leading the creation of the next generation of services enterprises in the world. And a couple of our businesses, Cyclum and Torque, are here to show you exactly what they do. but would love to continue the conversation. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks, Alison, for the opportunity to listen.